one of the co-chairs of the NASPA Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement Knowledge Community. So very glad to have you all here today. Just have a couple of quick announcements on behalf of the knowledge community before we get started. The first is that early registration is now open for the 2022 NASPA annual conference taking place in Baltimore, but also virtually. Just want to encourage everyone, if you are a NASPA member, even if you're not, to consider attending the conference. It's going to be a great get together for everyone. And another quick plug is that the knowledge community is also going to be hosting a pre-conference session on Saturday, March 19th. 2022 election cycle, Are You Ready? Is the name of that session. So we're hoping to see some of you there as well. But you can find all the information about that session on the NASPA conference website. And another quick announcement is that tomorrow, actually, Wednesday the 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern, the knowledge community is going to be hosting our November general body meeting, where we'll be joined by some representatives from the Student Leadership Programs knowledge community to share a new exciting resource, the Anti-Racist Terminology Guide that they've been working on in collaboration with the CLDE, KC, and a few other groups. So I can drop the link to register for that in the chat as well. And this will be a great opportunity. This is open to anyone. So these are just open meetings, but please feel free to attend. Again, that's tomorrow at 1 o'clock Eastern. And then just a couple other quick plugs. On our leadership team, we do have a couple of open positions which are available on the NASPA Volunteer Central website. Our communications and social media coordinator, our virtual learning and engagement coordinator, and our Region 6 representative are all open. So if you are interested in connecting more with the knowledge community and getting involved with the work at the national level, joining Christopher and myself, it's a really great way to get connected and a great way to meet some folks around the NASPA network. So those are all my quick updates, and I'm going to turn it back over to Christopher.
Awesome, thanks, Mike. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. For our panelists, if you would just take a moment, introduce yourself, name, institution, your kind of what your, let me try that again, sorry friends. Name, institution, and how long you have been maybe doing some of the civic engagement work. So for our panelists, whoever wants to start, please feel free.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Rafael Matos. I am the Director of Membership and Training at the International Headquarters of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. And as far as specifically the work of civic engagement and fraternities and sororities, I mean, I've been doing this work now since my initiation 22 years ago. So still going strong.
Great, thank you.
Next. Good afternoon. My name is Eric Norman, and I serve as the Vice President for Student Affairs at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. I have been working really with all types of civic engagement, even as a high schooler, very involved with different nonprofits, and I actually work for different nonprofit entities prior to coming into higher education. So worked in the nonprofit sector, then slid over to higher education. Great,
thank you.
My name is Brian Duffy. I am the Executive Director and CEO of Delta Lambda Phi Social Fraternity. Lucky to count Christopher as one of my brothers. And I've been doing this work, again, I would say what Raphael said, which is generally from the time that I was initiated. And in fact, the reason I got initiated was specifically because of civic engagement work that my chapter was doing around their ability to be accepted into IFC at the time. So, I mean, that's been since 2002.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Spencer Long. I work at the Sigma Alpha Epsilon headquarters as their Senior Director of Member Education Development. Prior to working at SAE, I worked at UIC as the Director of Student Leadership and Civic Engagement for 5 years. So formally working in the space for 5 years, working on voting engagement, service learning, things like that. But prior to that, kind of similar to everybody, I'm an Eagle Scout, so I've been doing civic engagement my whole life, trying to understand how we can get more people engaged in our communities, both through formal voting and otherwise. So thanks, Chris.
Great. Thank you all for being here. We will put the questions in the chat for folks so they can, for ease and accessibility. But our first question is going to be, how would you define civic engagement?
I'm working with the Piazza Institute at Penn State, and one of the definitions we're using to help define all of this is from Peyton and Moody. So it's the voluntary action towards the public good. So leveraging all the time, talent, and treasure that we have as a community to make things a better place.
When I think about civic engagement, I define it as the connection that an individual or a group has with the community of individuals that they are a part of, whether that is locally, whether that is virtually, whether that is nationally or internationally. But it's the commitment and the exchange of ideas, information, and resources between individuals or groups and their communities.
I think I will add to that the element of an activity. Like, what is it that we're actually doing? So it's that active engagement, actively doing something within the communities to really drive and preserve and uphold that value and importance in the community.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I'm not a guru of defining things, so I like to go to definitions that are out there as well. And some of the things I've taken away from the ones that I looked up is this idea of knowledge, skills, values, motivation, to make a difference, right? And it's about promoting quality of life in the community, and that could be politically or non-politically. So I think there's a lot of ways to slice this and look at it. And as Brian said, anywhere in between out my front door to all the way across the world, right? I think there's a lot of ways to be plugged in that way as well.
Great. So our next question, what is your experience working with fraternities and sororities in the civic engagement space, and in what ways have you found that they intersect?
Well, I mean, like I said, I've been doing it prior to joining my fraternity, but as far as in the space with a fraternity and sorority community since my initiation, actually before then, done it at the local, regional, now working for the international headquarters, get to see that as well, how it's happened on a much more global scale. I think that the two intersect. I think as a member of a historical Black Greek-led organization within the NPAC, I think we were founded at a time where Black communities of color, particularly Black communities, were oppressed, marginalized, and we did not have a lot of rights. So while we've always had a social component, we really focus a lot on that engagement with communities. Like, how do we get information out there? Like, for instance, with Phi Beta Sigma, since 1924, we conceptualized this notion of having a program to encourage Black businesses, right? And to encourage that kind of economic empowerment amongst communities of color, right? And so I think that the two go hand in hand. I think it's a matter of understanding and being okay with stepping into that space, leaning in, and then making a difference.
I know this was mentioned earlier, but I'll say one of the reasons I got involved with a fraternity as an undergraduate was I was recruited to help with some community service projects. And in fact, I was working on my car, and this group of gentlemen came up and started helping me. And then after that, they said, "Hey, we're going to go out to the service project. You would be interested in joining us?" Yes. And then found out more about some of the different projects they would get involved with, and how as an individual unit, it connected with the governing council, in this case IFC, which then also connected to the larger Greek council of the institution, which then connected to the institution as a whole and the surrounding community. So the project working with the Piazza Center is to try to get students to understand what is their role in that. And it's not strictly to sign over a check, although it's certainly valued at times. But how do we get people to understand the more larger altruistic action that they're taking, and how they need to give back to improve things? We're all given a certain amount of privilege by coming through this higher education system, getting out of here with a degree and having a network that we can tap into. So how are we going to leverage those set of experiences and that network to continue to improve things?
Yeah, I'm an idealistic kind of guy in a lot of ways. So when I think about the idea of why higher education was created, right, it's this free exchange of ideas. And when I think of why states funded higher education for a while, and they still do, just not as much as they used to. And I always tell people the value proposition has changed, right? I think when states were funding higher education at a higher level, people were staying in their states, going back to their hometowns and helping engage people and give back, versus now people are much more transient. And the idea of higher education has been perceived as to be a personal gain rather than community gain. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's kind of the noise that's out there. And so when you add in the layer of fraternity and sorority, I think this goes right back to the values, right? I argue that when you combine leadership and service, which I can guarantee almost all of us have in our values as fraternity and sorority men and women, that the intersection of that is the idea of civic engagement, that you're leading through serving in the community. And so my experience of working with them has gone anywhere from doing voting drives or hosting candidates or advocating in community to, again, service, get your hands dirty service, or working in partner with specific organizations that have importance to the organization, right? All of us have national nonprofits or national community partners that we work with across all of our organizations. But that's just one way, right? There's nuances that every individual chapter organization does. But to me, that's the idealistic way of looking at it. Is there's this idea of this is what we were all founded to do, right?
One of the things, so first I want to note, as an agender person, I just want to acknowledge that there are fraternity and sorority individuals who do not identify as men or women, and that we want to make sure that we're able to include all of us in those conversations. Words matter. I want to talk about specifically that Delta Lambda Phi does not exist without civic engagement. We would not be an organization here in existence if it weren't for the fact that our communities needed the opportunity to gather and create safe spaces for each other and support each other in a way so that we could grow and that our communities could take shape. I think a lot of what Raphael said really applies to Delta Lambda Phi as well. We were an organization that was founded, right in the middle of the AIDS crisis, where many organizations and many government organizations were not supporting us. We needed to support ourselves. We needed to do that work and build that community and those bonds in order to exist and to thrive. And so I think fraternities and sororities, when you think about civic engagement with them, I think that without the civic engagement piece, the fraternity and sorority experience becomes very selfish and insular. And it is an experience that is about only knowing the people that you know and only experiencing the people that you have around you. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about civic engagement is that even inside our own individual community groups, our own experiences, there's a wealth of people who come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different financial classes and privileges, all of those things. And one of the things that community engagement allows us to do is to experience at a more higher level the varied nature of humanity and really appreciate and value the diversity. I often hear a lot of people talk about why can't we just focus on the things that make us similar instead of leaning on the things that make us different and divide us. And I think what is really important is the things that make us different are the things that I find most fascinating and valuable about all of us. And so I think community engagement and civic engagement is really about connecting with people who are different than you and learning from them and becoming a better person and leader because of that.
Great. So we've started to answer the next question. So we'll add it in there if there's anything you folks want to add, that would be awesome. What is a fraternity or sorority's responsibility to civic engagement?
I mean, I'll just pick up and finish off there. And, I think, as I said, I think there's a couple of reasons that fraternities and sororities have responsibility to civic engagement. One, fraternities and sororities exist within a framework of higher education that is very oftentimes funded by the public, But even if you're in a private university, I think it's important to understand that the money that creates the situations that your students enter into comes from people that's not just them. So they are supported by a community of people. And part of the work that you do in fraternity, we do in fraternity and sorority life, is give back to that community. So we have a responsibility to the community, because the community, again, is what allows us to exist. Without civic engagement, without the communities, and I really define, again, civic engagement as this engagement with community, we don't exist. And so we have to give back into that to create a synergistic cycle between the community and us. I think fraternities and sororities have a responsibility to leave, just like every individual does, but we hold ourselves as Greek organizations to higher standards, right? So we have a responsibility to improve the places around us, to improve the opportunities for individuals that we engage with. And the way you do that, again, is through civic engagement. I think, again, an organization without civic engagement is very insular and, is very sad. And I think it is telling that the organizations specifically that are founded out of the most need to have community with each other still understand very clearly how important that work is, to take that work right back out into the community. And even when they might have a justification for staying insular to protect themselves, they turn that around and take it right back into the community.
I'm going to continue. Most of the organizations obviously have an entity that they have aligned themselves with, or a cause. So I think it's part of the founding value and what they're supposed to do as an organization. This is also a training opportunity. So this is a chance for people to get to work on their leadership skills and to understand things in different ways and learn to work with others. So we need to press that so they can get to a point where it's a habit. And that way, when they graduate, they continue on, and they may continue to align exactly with the one national nonprofit or entity or cause, or as life progresses, they may choose their own. And that may shift depending upon what's going on with them in their lifespan, or where they're living, or a current issue. But this is a chance for them to understand who are we as beings, and why it's important to help each other. Fraternity and sorority are designed to help teach community, and why and how are we interconnected, and how are you best can be able to help one another with that.
Great, thanks. We appreciate that. So our next question has a couple of parts to it. So what trends have you witnessed across umbrella groups and councils as it relates to civic engagement? How do we help fraternities and sororities and different councils become more civically engaged? What strategies should we consider in mobilizing entire fraternity and sorority communities?
This is a tough question to answer, I think, because a lot of different campuses have different cultures related to this. I think in some trends you see people only doing service, some trends you only see people doing philanthropy or fundraising, some you see doing nothing or work that they think is civic engagement, not necessarily making a global impact, but maybe something that's on their campus, but it's not necessarily having a more global impact. Those are some trends that I think of just off the top of my head. I think how we get them to think differently is, I think what Brian was saying, is get them exposed to people who are different than themselves, and have those conversations to help understand the differences and what folks' experiences are, to help them think more critically about that. Not to speak for Brian, but that was what I took away from it, and that that can be the way of mobilizing communities. Or if universities are taking an action in a specific area, meaning like we want to have a really high impact in this neighborhood or this community or whatever, that can be a way to mobilize people to around a joint cause from the institution or through a national office, right? I mean, national offices can drive kind of where people spend their time based on a national philanthropy or national service partner as well.
So I think when you talk about trends, I think the trends are dictated by what's happening across the country, right? And so when I think about what has happened in the last 2 years, right, you look at, say, with the death of George Floyd or the murder of George Floyd, right? You see something like that, that just been a catalyst. And even a few things before, right? For now, to where I see a lot of communities having conversations around the racial reckoning, right? Let's deal with these injustices and inequities that are taking places on the campus. I think that when you're talking about how do you mobilize organizations and communities, I think part of it is, right, like, is the work meaningful and to be transformative, or are you being more performative, right? When I looked at, again, using last year with the death of George Floyd, right? Organizations issuing statements and their members demanding more from the organizations, right? But the organizations not really engaging in that. So I think that we're expecting students to behave and to act accordingly in a certain way at the local level, but we also have to think about internationally from the headquarters perspective, from the parent organization, right? Like, what is being communicated to them and what kind of resources are being presented to them to actually mobilize? Because again, you're thinking about traditional age college students, right? Most of them between maybe 19 to 21, 24 being that cap. Some of them may not have the skills necessary to understand how to do this because maybe they haven't done it or haven't done it on the scale. So I think a part of it is to mobilize them. You got to present them with resources and have the coaching and support. But again, I think that a part of that has to do with where is the organization and the parent organization, right? That the national, international body, and is this something that is of value that they want to get behind and promote?
I'll piggyback off of that. Yeah, you're hitting it right on. Yeah, it's the movement from egoism to altruism. And what is that process? And I remember when I was a new professional in fraternity and sorority life, I got frustrated when people were focusing more on the event being fun. So, well, the purpose behind this event is to raise money, which let's focus on the cause. Well, that's the more important element of this. Yes, I want it to be fun. But we're doing this activity, this event, this act, whatever it may be, to help this agency. So how can we learn about that agency and how can we best help them? And yes, I'm sure raising money is certainly helpful, but what are some other things they need? And many hands make light work. So do we recruit that way? Are we bringing people in that have that mindset and have been raised that way? Or are we helping people that have not had that type of training experiences to understand the larger meaning of why we're here? And that takes some leverage in some cases. In some cases, we know there are certainly fraternities or campuses that understand at a very deep level and everyone moves in a common direction. For those that don't, how do we maneuver them to understand that? That's what we're working on with the Piazza Center right now.
I think, Christopher, we talked about some of the trends, and I think one of the things that we haven't touched on is that there are so many more distractions that are asking for students' time today. The ability for students to be aware of crises across the world has never been greater. And there is a tendency for those students to feel helpless in the face of global catastrophes that they feel, completely outside of their wheelhouse. They're trying to go to college. They're trying to get a degree. They're trying not to be too sad about the last person who dumped them. All of these things that they're dealing with into day to day. So many of them are just trying to be able to have a place to live at the same time they're attending school and everything. And I think we have to recognize that we need to pay attention to what our students are interested in. So when I think about the trends, I think we have to be very responsive to the places where students are interested and have energy behind them and capture that. I don't care if the thing that you're passionate about is the fact that there is a, for example, the parking spots are going up 150%. The cost of parking spots are going up 150%. If that's what everybody is passionate about in your chapter or in your community, let's mobilize on that. Let's talk what we can do there. Let's talk about why that's happening, what the opportunities are in terms of engagement and in terms of advocacy, and teach students with the tools that are right in front of them. If we take that opportunity to really pay attention to what students are interested in, to what the community is responding to, and leverage off of that, I think there's a really good opportunity for capturing their engagement and their energy, and then showing them through that how there is an opportunity to do this in other areas that they may not have thought they had the ability to advocate in. But I think we have to start with where they are, and we need to be comfortable with doing so, because our goal here, honestly, is to give them the tools to make a difference for the rest of their lives. I always talk with our actives and I say, you know, you get 4 years here, but you get 40 or 50 years as an alumnus. The story that you start now is one that I need you to continue for the rest of your life. And so I am personally less concerned about whether the things that they do inside of their chapter have a global or outsized impact than that they learn the processes, the tools, and the motivations for continuing to do that for the rest of their lives.
Awesome, thank you all. So that leads into our next question. When considering civic discourse, how should fraternities and sororities partake in events like rallies and marches, if at all? And what about voter registration? Is that different?
And one of the things to consider, right, and I get it, right? I hear the argument, we're nonprofits, we can't do it because we're nonprofit, right? Like as a nonprofit organization, Phi Beta Sigma can't endorse a candidate, right? We can't do that. What Phi Beta Sigma can do is encourage its members to engage, to participate in our civic duty, to go out and vote. We can put resources out there to let our members know about this is how you can go and cast your vote, or some of our chapters, they'll do forums where they're putting information out about all measures that need to be paid special attention to, right? So I think that one, we can't hide behind our nonprofit status and use that as the reason why we can't engage, right? So in terms of going to marches, I know something that we've done is we've encouraged our members, right? Because there's Phi Beta Sigma, the collective, right? The entity that's known as Phi Beta Sigma, and then they are the men of Phi Beta Sigma, right? The individual. So while Phi Beta Sigma as a fraternity may not necessarily show up to every march, right? Like we encourage our members to be active in our communities. One thing that we did last year, as you know, the protests were taking place around the country, we issued a guide to our members in terms of how they can be out there, how they can support. Because for our members, it's important that they're out there and being involved, and they also want to show their Phi Beta Sigma pride, right? And show themselves as members of the organization. So we just talk to them about ways in which they can do it, in which honors that need to represent the fraternity, but also keeps them safe and keeps them protected. So we provide them with that. So yeah.
Go ahead, Spencer.
I was just going to say, when large organizations are tough, right? Like we have people on both extremes of the political spectrum in the organization that I work for and that I'm a member of. And so nationally, I think Raphael hit it right on, is that we can provide resources to help people educate themselves and to take a stance for them. Voter registration, I've always claimed there's no politics in voter registration at all. We're not telling you who to vote for. We're not telling you how to vote. We're just encouraging you to vote and providing resources to educate who you want to vote for. But at the same point, right, I think there are avenues where there are times for organizations to take stands on things that are important to themselves too. Like, for instance, fraternities and sororities came together to take a stand against Harvard when they were trying to abolish the whole organizations, or being members of organizations and having that count negatively towards your enrollment as a student, right? This freedom of association. There are things that are like that impact the entire organization, that there are times to have discourse. And I think we bring it up too in our organizations as well, about having people have the free exchange of ideas, right? That it's okay to disagree on topics, to talk through them. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all in the same organization. We have to come back to the table, come back to the same house. And so, in some cases, and so how do we do that in a responsible way that still is cordial and respectful to not even just our members, but other members as well.
And I think something that Spencer just said triggered a thought in my head, which is you can also, as one, I think for us, for my fraternity, we look at the things that are, we partner with organizations that support our values, right? So we recognize we just can't be everywhere. We can't support every single cause because we just don't have that bandwidth as an organization. But we think about what our founding values, who our membership, our primary membership that we service, and then we look to get involved with those causes. And then to further expand our reach, we partner with organizations that are already doing that kind of work that maybe Phi Beta Sigma can't necessarily step into 100%, but that we can partner with, say we form a partnership with the NAACP to do some kind of work, whether that's forming a scholarship or participate in a particular program. So we look for other partnerships to increase our reach. So it's not just about us doing the work, but looking for those other partners that will help us expand our reach.
I think it's important to note the difference between 501c3s and 501c7s in terms of the restrictions on political activities. As we talk about rallies, marches, voter registration, there's this concept again that, you know, there's something like everything is politics and politics is everything. I also think that the reason I think this is important, especially for many of our culturally based organizations or organizations like Delta Lambda Phi, that is at some level culturally based, though it's a different type of cultural definition. When you think about the rules that we exist under, and this is the thing that always comes up. It's like, what about the rules? What about, as everybody has said, right? We exist primarily for, pleasure, recreation, and other nonprofit purposes. However, when you are an organization of individuals who have been historically oppressed and marginalized by literally the country and situations like around that, you cannot engage in pleasure, recreation, and other nonprofit purposes without advocating for your ability to be recognized as a human being in this country. And so I think that we have to consider the reasons that our organizations were founded, and we have to consider about what are the values that we hold and how those values align with things like rallies and marches and voter registration. I mean, literally, I think every single Delta Lambda Phi chapter ever has been in a pride parade. Pride parades are rallies and marches, right? Like, we do these things because they align with our values, right? And we acknowledge that what we can't do, as Raphael said, is we can't advocate for like a specific candidate, right? But like that is the smallest piece of what civic discourse and engagement looks like. And everything else is how you even get to the point to help put values in office, not people, but values, right? What I think the goal of our organization should be in general is to, again, create a space where individuals can become closer and connect and create a brotherhood while having an opportunity to change change the discourse for the world, right? To make the world a better place. So I think it all comes from a values lens, and you have to consider how your organization engages in those spaces based on your values.
Great. So that values piece leads into our next question. I appreciate you all doing that. How does civic engagement connect with a fraternity or sorority's organizational purpose and values? How would you recommend this conversation be introduced to our organizations?
Honestly, I hope it's on the front end of the process of even bringing someone into the agency. It is a core element of who we are. So I think we need to make sure people are aware of that, so they're not brought into it after the fact. Oh, you joined this agency or this organization, and we do this. It needs to be very much on the forefront. Gary, were you about to say something?
Oh, I think I accidentally clicked on mute. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, not to sound funny, but it may sound a little bit funny, but I mean, it depends on what your values are, and I think that that's a piece of it, is that we assume all fraternities and sororities are created the same and espouse to the same thing. Reality is we're not, right? And I can speak for my organization and what those tenets are and what we're taught and what we teach our members, right? And the conversations that we have, because you can see across our brand, whether you look at the international website or the local level, is this a consistency there? So I think first and foremost is realizing, does your organization talk about civic engagement, right? In a manner that means advocating for the public good. And then thinking about how does that advocacy for the public good looks like. Look, I won't knock it if for you encourage your members to focus on getting their degrees, but then getting that degree to what end, right? And so that's the thing, like you're gaining this knowledge to improve yourself. That piece that needs to be highlighted is, well, when you get that degree, how are you reaching back? Like, how are you giving back? Like getting your degree is not just the end of it, but it's the beginning towards something else. I think the way you introduce it, I'm gonna tell you about a conversation I had with an IFC chapter president I used to advise. He came to me, he said he was mad. He was mad at his new members. I said, well, why are you mad at them? I said, because they don't want to go and volunteer. I said, okay, well, what did you tell them when you recruited them? Well, we told them they needed, brotherhood, right? And I said, but they did service in during the new member program. I said, well, was that a part of the thing for them to join? Yes. Okay, well, you see how the issues there? You didn't recruit them based on doing service or being civically engaged and involved. And then you did one thing they had to do to join, and that was that, like there was no conversation. So I think to introduce it, I mean, one, our chapters have to do those things, right? Two, that the new members are not the only ones doing it, but that the actors are actually doing it. That is an expectation. And I mean, three is also, what is the quality of the engagement? I think what all of us have said here, a theme that I've heard, not said this way, but this is what it sounded to me, is what is that quality of that engagement and what is it that we're putting our emphasis on?
Yeah, Raphael, I like what you're saying. I want to also acknowledge that every fraternity and sorority should have already had this conversation, or did at one point. I want to be clear, like they all have values. The question, even more than what Raphael was saying, I think, or building off of that, is how are they living up to those values today? Do those values that they espouse still align with what the organization believes itself to be and what its chapters believe themselves to be? And if not, how do you find alignment there? And then, how do you take that alignment and do something with it? Because I absolutely agree, if you are only doing things like bowling and like a movie night and stuff like that for your recruitment, people are not going to expect when they get in that they're going to have to do, philanthropies and service projects and work in the community. That's not going to be an expectation, but also the actors aren't going to do it if you're not telling them about the work that your alumni are doing in that space. If you're not highlighting what it looks like to be a good alumnus in your organization, then you're not setting that model for your actors either. And so I think it's incumbent upon every single member of an organization to really be living the values that they were taught. And if those values were not taught well, or they were not taught clearly, to be holding the organization to account for those values. I think that, we talk about the conversation being introduced. To some degree, we're past that point of introducing the conversation. It's about it's about reminding everyone that they should have been having the conversation and they stopped at some point.
Great, thank you all, I appreciate that. So to shift focus just a little bit, we touched on this ever so slightly earlier when Brian was talking about 501c3s and C7s, but what laws or regulations must a fraternity or sorority consider when deciding to become civically engaged, and how might that affect their existence as nonprofits?
this is not my wheelhouse at all, but I think the status understands that not all fraternities are considered nonprofits, right? I mean, there are foundations that are part of fraternities that are nonprofits, but then you go into the status of the social club aspect of it, and there's some different things there. I mean, we've got a lot of things to take into consideration beyond just civically engaged, right? I mean, there's a lot of laws that apply to running fraternities and sororities that folks have to comply with. But yeah, for us, it's more, I think more of the things that we talk about and get behind is how does it align with our values more so often than if we're complying with the law. Because most of the time, at least from my experience, we're within that area.
Me and Google are really good friends. And so I did a little Googling before. And a couple of things that I think is really important to think about when you're thinking about civic engagement. So an example is for 501 fraternities and sororities. Most of our fraternities and sororities are organized as 501c7 not nonprofit organizations, which means that we do have to pay things like sales tax, but we are exempt from paying tax to the government. One of the things that we have to be careful about, an example is, for example, if you are a fraternity and you have houses, right? You need to think about if you organize activities, whether you're allowing non-members to use those houses for activities. So if we talk about civic engagement, we want to be careful. For example, if you're inviting an organization in to use your house to hold an activity, you have to think about making sure that you're keeping track of that in a way that satisfies the IRS. I think the other big thing is just like really from a focus perspective is like you got to be able to tie the majority of your activities back to a social and recreational purpose. And so understanding the connection from the civic engagement that you do and how that plays into social and recreational purposes is important. Like I think those are probably the two big things to understand is that like you have to do social and recreational things for your organization. Your organization can't only be like letter writing campaigns, get out the vote campaigns, all of those. Like you have to do the brotherhood or sisterhood part. Like you got to do that part as well. Like that's the reason that you get founded. So it's really understanding how those two things go together and work together. And I think really it's a thing that we should all understand a bit more intuitively because you need community to make action happen. And so if you focus on building that community has the ability to then move into action.
I think a point that Brian brought up, I mean, there's liability in everything that I do in my job. I look at liability, right? And we're engaging. Sure, it's great to go into a community. I mean, we can think about specific laws. I think about the conditions that may put the organization at a risk of being held extremely liable for something taking place. And so I think that that's something that, is a valid concern. And so I think that as we engage, like I think about our organization where we go and plan out certain things, participate in certain activities, we're thinking about, all right, how is this going to pan out? How is this going to work? Our general counsel gets involved to answer certain things, especially if we're going to get into MOUs and partnerships and things of that nature. We talk about that. That's at the international level. At a local level, I think it's also being able to advise chapters that they shouldn't enter into certain activities without consulting the organization, certain agreements or things of that nature, because again, they may not have that authority to do so. So I think it's always balancing in terms of making a distinction between what can the chapter do as a recognized agent of the organization, and where does that autonomy to do those things stop, and where do they need to then check in with the international national body to figure out how they can proceed or how they can partner.
Raphael, one thing off of that, I think you hit on a really good thing, which is like there's always this tension between students really wanting to be self-governed and the reality that there are structures and guidelines and things we have to satisfy as an international organization outside of that. And I think the more that we can make sure that that's that they're provided a framework that allows them to make those decisions on their own in a safe way, the more effectively we can both balance both of those equations. Because we all know the fastest way to kill a chapter is tell them they have to do a bunch of things, because they will just be like, nah, why are you trying to tell me what to do? So but giving them the tools and saying you can make a decision inside anywhere of this is like really powerful.
Awesome. So one of the things that we want to try to do is give a few takeaways from today, just a couple of like to-dos or opportunities for to-dos. So our next question, how could units overseeing civic engagement education and fraternity and sorority life partner together to bring education about this topic to our organizations?
Actually do it. I mean, that's the biggest thing. I mean, they may laugh, but I was on the same floor at an institution running civic engagement as a fraternity and sorority life office, and we never did a joint activity. We'd always talk about it, or we'd run a day of service, and I'd be like, where are all the fraternities and sororities on this day of service that we both said we wanted to do for campus or as a campus initiative, right? I think one of the easiest things to overlook is just what are the opportunities that already exist both ways, right? And that's what you have to think about as a partnership. It goes both ways. And so, and then thinking about, okay, what are the needs and wants of the community that your civic engagement education unit can use to bring in to educate the members as well, right? So it may seem really a silly thing, but just do it and work together on something, right? I think I always joked with colleagues, there was never a thing on collaboration on the annual evaluation. You didn't get evaluated on how well you collaborated with everybody else, but everyone on campus said they wanted to do it, that in partnerships, but it was never part of how anybody was evaluated, because it's a lot of work to do a good partnership, because it's a lot of people working together to make it happen. So
my experience on campuses, especially in the development of the 5-star program in CAP, what I did was I made sure that the assessment program did recognize collaboration. They got more points that way. And then, in fact, the more they collaborated, the more funding they were able to receive. Because rather than having 10 individual programs, it's better to have one effective large-scale program where everyone's united. But this also to be sustained. It can't be the one-off. It can't be, as you mentioned, Spencer, where we do it during the new member process and you're not responsible for anything else after that. How do we bring this on a regular basis to help people understand the reason for this? You could cycle in speakers. You can bring in a new nonprofit every meeting, or maybe one a month, or maybe once a month you go to a nonprofit, or you go to a community and you try to understand what is their lived life and how is it different, and how can you work together?
I think units overseeing, so I'll start it like this. As I said, we've got a wildly diverse range of experiences and foci inside of our different chapters. And so I think at times, intentions to do one thing that gets everybody engaged and involved are doomed to be like mediocre. Unless there's like a massive culture around this already at your organization, your university, and you come into that. I think about like Penn State and Thon, right? Like there's an existing culture that you are inculcated into that. But if you don't have that on your university campus, I think you need to start by finding out what your individual chapters are passionate about. I think you have to partner with your like, civic engagement needs to be working with fraternity and sorority life, who is working with the international organization who understands about its chapters, so that if there's 3 chapters that are really interested in something, spin up something for them to do. If there's 4 chapters that are interested in doing something else, spin up chapters for something for them to do. One of the things, again, I think we talked about is just getting them started. I think the first time you do civic engagement and community engagement, it helps for something to be really in something that you're personally passionate about. But the next time and the next time and the next time, you start to understand the value of civic engagement for for the public good, not just for your own good, but for the public good, and your opportunities expand to create a more, a more general or a more global program. But I think it's got to start local, because you're not going to get like I'm just like SAE. I love SAE, but like on our campus at Kent State at the time, SAE was not going to show up for like a gay pride event in 2006, right? But there, it's like, and then capitalize, I think, already on the opportunities that your campus has. That, we have like a Greek week, and like everybody has different feelings about Greek week, but it's a great way to get students involved in civic engagement because they're doing something that's going to go to a cause. And so you can capitalize on those to sort of say, like, look at all these individual things you did and see how it adds up to this, and talk to you how to do this thing.
Great. So we just have about 5 minutes left. So for our last question that we have for the day, what's next? What do you all see on the horizon with regards to this work?
I think for me, what I see as next is just really, we talk about, I think we talk a lot, fraternities and sororities, right? We talk a lot about building curriculum on how you can become better leaders, better men, better women, better individuals, right? Those sort of things. But I think is, how do we start providing our organizations with curriculum? How do you engage civically, right? Like, what does that mean? I think that what I've seen the past year and a half or so since the pandemic started, and there's a lot of reckoning taking place. I mean, we've seen that abolish Greek life movement, and we can all have our feels and ideas about it. I think there's a call out that came from that we're not ignoring, is that people want us to pay our rent, right, on these campuses, right? What was it that Gandhi said? Service is the rent that you pay for your space on earth, right? Like, I think campuses want us to be better, and we can't talk about being better, but we're not doing that, right? And so I think it's not just about the service acts that we do when we all put on our shirts and go pass out food at that homeless shelter, but I think it's when we talk about the public good, like, how are we helping our members understand that that public good is also invested in how they interact with campus community members? And I don't think that that's necessarily like that micro level conversation. Like, we can talk about the big lofty ideas, but I think if we really want to help them to understand what that looks like, let's talk about what does it mean to just be a good citizen, period. Like, what does it mean to be a campus, right? If you're an organization with a heteronormative culture and everyone or the majority of folks identify as men, what does that look like when you're talking about women, right? You can have your own feels, your own thoughts and perceptions, but understand that in the context of these letters and this fraternal organ identity that you share, you're communicating something when you behave that way. And I think that those are some of the conversations we got to start having, because we're seeing accountability. We are in an age of digital accountability, right? And so that we got to start having those conversations with our members. So in closing, my thoughts on this: you really want to drive home and teach about civic engagement, we have to help our members understand just what it means to just be a good person and to be involved in, like, how do you incorporate into your everyday life?
I think there's 3 things that are going to shape the next generation in this work. 1, the problems are closer to home. And I say that because income inequality continues to increase. The cost of education continues to outstrip the ability of students to pay it. Mental health is an incredible crisis in this country, especially around our students. All of that means that so many of the issues that we used to go out into the community to deal with exist inside our chapters. And so we need to be just, in fact, there's an opportunity to connect the concept of civic engagement with caring for each other at a chapter level, right? I think we can all recognize the power of those fraternity stories where the chapters do something for one of their members who is struggling with an issue, or who might who has had cancer, all sorts of things, right? And the students learn through that experience what civic engagement means because they connect with so many other people. But it's the person inside their community that brought them in, and we have so many more opportunities for that. Number two, our students are going to continue to have less time and less energy to do all of the legwork on their own. And it's not their own fault. The requirements for them to be able to simply make it through college have skyrocketed so high. And the number of things that they're expected to be able to do in order to look like a good student has increased. And so we have to recognize that that is something that we need to be able to provide them with better packages and better tools that let them hit the ground running, instead of having to do a lot of the startup work on their own. There's a place for that. There's an opportunity to learn that. But today, those students will throw that package away and say, this is too much work for me, before investing into that. Until you have them 2 or 3 years, right? That's the thing, especially if you're going to be acquiring new students. And then finally, we're going to continue to go digital. It's going to be a thing. We're going to be online. There's going to be more opportunities for visibility online. Raphael talked about digital accountability. The best way, besides not doing something stupid on the internet, which everyone's going to do, to handle digital accountability is to also do a whole lot of amazing stuff and make sure that people are aware of that on the internet, right? Again, it gives us this opportunity to think not just locally, but globally. So I think we have to grant that opportunity for our students while acknowledging fundamentally, and we just saw this over the past couple of years, the online experiences is not the same as in person. And so while there may be economies of scale you can leverage from being online, you need to pair that with a high quality in-person experience that can give people the best of both worlds. I think if you're going to continue to move that way, and your students will want to because they think it'll be easy. But I think it's really important to help them understand that you get people to do things by connecting with them, and connection is harder this way. It just is.
I'm just going to add, we're studying this all with the Piazza Center. That's the main focus of our little group. So we're looking at assessments that are out there, trying to figure out what's the baseline that students come in with, and then how do they change over their undergraduate experience and beyond that. We're looking at folks that have been effective at teaching this, and what are the systems that have been very helpful at leveraging people to understand that greater good. And then we're going to talk about it. We're going to have conferences, put out papers, do plenary sessions, and continue to make sure that we can get that information out into the different communities.
I know this may be somewhat controversial for some people, but I'm going to say it. I think we also have to tell the story that we're doing it, because a lot of times the headlines are only the negative things that happen in fraternities and sororities, and there's a missed opportunity to showcase all the good that we're doing, and that involves collecting data and sharing it, and maybe not being so humble or bragging a little bit to folks out there. So that's what I see as being next, is we've got to help use these opportunities to change the narrative on positive experiences that are happening that within the organizations that go back to the values on what we were all founded on. So I like to call it the back to basics kind of movement, but we got to get back to why our organizations were all founded and we're doing what we're doing.
And Spencer, I think it can't be overstated how important, we often forget about telling that story is just as important for the students who are doing it as it is for the rest of the community. There's a thing that happens when you have the opportunity to tell a positive story about yourself and it's true, and see it reflected in the media and come back to you. There's a reinforcement loop that happens there. And when we don't give our students the opportunity to tell the positive stories about themselves, just as much as they see the negative stories about themselves, we're affecting them in that process. And so the opportunity to create those positive stories and tell them is so important. It will make them better people.
I just want to say last thing. I think what Spencer said, he really hit it on the head. Part of telling your story right, it does a few things. One, you're telling your story so other people know what you're doing. But what that also do is, if our chapter at Penn State is doing fantastic, right? And that means our chapter, University of South Florida, they have to uphold that, because we're seeing what is out there. So someone understands what Phi Beta Sigma does very well. Two, I think people then, other organizations that see your brand and they like what you're doing, they're going to come and reach out to you to want to get involved and bring those extra activities and opportunities to you. And so like, I think that's a really great way to form collaborations, and sometimes have collaborations find you.
Great. Well, we are a few minutes over. I want to take just a quick second to thank our panelists for all of their time and their information today. I want to thank our friends at NASPA, both in both knowledge communities as well as Big NASPA, for supporting us. I also want to take 5 seconds and do a personal thank you to Mike McFadden, Lindsay Wilker, and Dr. Bianca Williams for their support and pulling all of this together, and for their help and giving me space to do these questions look okay and have that moment of freak out of where no one's going to come. But I really want to thank all of you for your time today. And we wish you all a great rest of your week, and be safe and be well.